Hey all, welcome back. This is our day 7 in this Python beginners tutorial playlist journey. So let's get started and watch the video till the very end. So we are going to learn more about functions, and in the previous videos we learned that functions are a really handy way of taking a complex set of instructions and packaging them together inside a block of code that has a name given to it. And when we need all of the lines of code that's packaged inside this function, all we have to do at any point late on in our code is just to call the functions by typing its name and then a set of brackets. And when this line of code is run, it's going to search for where this function is defined, which is up here, and then it's going to execute all the lines of code that are contained within it. Now, it's been a little while since we have seen functions. Now, let's create a new function called greet, and we will give it 3 lines of print statement telling it to do 3 things. And finally, once you are done, go ahead and call the function so that it gets executed in the console. So to create a function, we of course need a def keyword. And we know it's a keyword because as soon as we type it, it changes to the blue color. And after the keyword, we get to give our function a name. So in my case, it's called greet. Now after the greet, we add a set of brackets after the name of the function. Finally, we add a colon and we enter into the block of code because we are indented over. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is to create a print statement that just say hey, and then I'm going to print statement that just say what's up, and finally we are going to add a final print statement that just say bye. So now that we have created our function, it's time to actually trigger the function, or what we see in programming lingo call the function. And we do that by calling the name of the function and then calling a set of brackets. And now once the code reaches line 7, it's going to search for this greet function, which it will find over here, and then it's going to carry out each of the lines of code one by one. So let's run the code and you should see each of the 3 print statements being called. So that's pretty simple. Notice that every single time I call the greet function, it's going to do the same thing, right? It's just going to print out those 3 lines of code. Now, in reality, it's very rare that you will want to repeat the same instructions every single time when you call a function. It would be nice, wouldn't it, if we could modify some of the parts of the code inside the function and allow for a little bit of variation. For example, it would be nice if we could greet somebody by the name so that it could say hey Sheikha instead of just hey, what's up Sheikha. So that it would change each time I call this function. Maybe next time it will be what's up Jack, etc. So how can we achieve this kind of functionality? Well, we need to look more closely at these brackets. Now, what we can do is we can actually add the name of a variable inside those brackets to start giving our function some inputs. So let's say that there are variable called something that's going to be passed to my function, and this something can then be used inside the block of code, and I could do something with it. Now, in order to actually pass this value when I call my function, I have to add the data inside the brackets. So let's say I decide to pass over 1, 2, 3 over. Well, in this case, when this lines of codes get triggered, the computer is going to search for where this function is declared, which is up here, and then it's going to pass over the piece of data 1, 2, 3 to this variable called something. So now, effectively, inside the function called my function called something that's equal to 1, 2, 3, and that can can then be used inside the block of code to do something with that piece of data. Now, it's a little bit like plugging in a USB stick into a computer. If we took a different piece of input, we would end up with a different file being shown by the computer. So this means the computer can do something different depending on the input that we give it. And if we change the input, then it will receive a different piece of data. So in addition to a simple function, we can also create a function that allows for the input. And to do that, you saw earlier on, the syntax is again the same as before. We use a def keyword to create the function, and then let's just give it a slightly different name to differentiate it with the previous function, greet with name. And then inside the brackets, instead of leaving it blank, we get to create the name of the variable that's going to be passed over. So let's just call it name, because that describes the data that's going to be received. It's going to be the name of the person that I wish to greet. So now let's add a colon, and finally we can create our print statement. So I'm just going to copy these print statements from above, and now instead of having these names hard coded in here, I'm going to delete it and I'm going to replace those names with the value of this variable. So I'm going to put it in using an f string like this, and then I'm going to do the same down here, right? When we actually call this function, it's also going to be a little bit different from previously. So now, firstly, the name of the function has changed, but notice how it's expecting some sort of input inside the brackets, and it tells me that if wants to receive a name, it's when we call the function that we actually pass over the piece of data that's going to be stored inside this variable. Let's give it my own name, Sheikha. And now when I hit run, I want you to predict what's going to happen. What's actually going to be printed? So let's go ahead and comment out the previous lines of code and now run our code, and you should see that it says, hey Sheikha, what's up Sheikha? So this piece of data has basically been inserted under this variable name, and then it's been put into both of these print statements. Now if I go ahead and call this function with a different piece of data, say a different name, then it's going to use that piece of data to modify this function. So it does something a little bit different. So this way we can create own function that carries out some instructions, but every time we execute it, it gets a modify it a little bit by changing the inputs. When we are talking about functions with inputs, there's two things that we are working with that's really important to differentiate. So we know that when we call this function and we pass over this piece of data, effectively we are creating a new variable called something, and we are setting it to equal this piece of data that we are passing it. Now in programming lingo, you will hear this being referred to as the parameter, and this piece of data being referred to as the argument. Now, the argument is the actual piece of data that's going to be passed over to this function when it's being called, whereas the parameter is the name of the data, and we use the parameter inside the function to refer to it and to do things with it. The parameter is the name of the data that's being passed in. The argument is the actual value of the data. So we saw a very simple form of a function that allows for an input. Now I want to take it even further, and I want to create a function that allows for multiple inputs. So let's comment out the previous line of code and let's create a new comment. Functions with more than one input. And I am going to create a new function called greet underscore with, and in this case it's going to take two parameters. It's going to be name and location. If you remember, this is how we added a parameter previously. So we know that if we wanted to add one parameter name, and then this is how we would do it. We would just add it inside the brackets. Now if I wanted to have more than one parameter, all we have to do is just add a comma and then add the second parameter, which we said was going to be called location. So now this particular function is going to take two inputs, the name and the location, and then inside this function we are going to print and ask them what is it like in their particular location. See if you can modify this to use the actual parameter and to replace them with print statements, so that we use that these parameters inside of our function. So essentially we want to create a print statement here, and print statement prints strings, so we have to add some quotation mark around the text. And finally I'm going to use a f string to replace this parameter name inside this string, so that the data that gets passed in gets replaced here, and it says hello whatever their name is. And uh, that the data gets passed in gets replaced next, and it says what is it like in and whatever the location is. So now it means I can call this function by calling greet with, and it's going to prompt me to add both of these inputs, and the first piece of data is going to be the name, and you can see it's giving you a hint by underlining the name of the parameter. And let's put Rashid, and then we can add the second piece of data and separate it with a comma, and now you can see this underline has moved to the location parameter. So again, as a hint as to what kind of data it wants, so let's say that Rashid is at Alain now. So if we go ahead and run this code, and then you will see that it's going to print hello and replace name with Rashid. And then what is it like in Alain? So Alain gets replaced with this location. So that means that you can now put in as many inputs, many pieces of inputs as you want, and modify the functionality of your function to make your function so different things each time. Now here's a question: what happens if I call the same function greet with, but I switch the order of the data that I give it? So let's say the first piece of data I give it is Alain, and then the second piece of data is Rashid. So we have just switched the order of these pieces of data. Now what do you expect to happen? Let's click run, and you can see that it's now completely nonsense. Now hello Alain, what is it like in Russian? And what actually happened here is it takes the position of data, looks at both of these arguments, and first argument gets assigned to the first parameter, the second argument gets assigned at the second parameter. So in this case, when it's actually gone in here, now name is equal to Alain, which is why this line printed this, and Rashid is now assigned to location, which is why it printed this second line like so. And in Python programming, this is called a positional arguments. When we call the function, we haven't specified anywhere which particular parameter we want to associate these pieces of data with. So it just gone and looked at the position. Now this is the default way of calling functions, because on one hand, when you are typing out the code, you get the hints here as to which piece of data you need to enter, but also you can refer to the function and look at the orders of the parameters. Now, what if you wanted to be more clear when you actually call the function, so you don't ever encounter this problem? Well, you could use something called keyword arguments instead. So now, instead of just adding the arguments into function call like this, we can actually add each of parameter name and an equal sign. And now when we actually change the order around, it doesn't matter how we order it. So when we call the function, we still use the name. So it's greet with. So everything up to the first bracket is the name, and then we add in each of these parameters name, and then we add an equal sign, and finally we give it the actual value. So let's say Rashid, and then the location is going to be equal to Alain. Now when I hit run, you can see it does pretty much the same as before. It puts Sheikha into name and Alain into Rashid. Sorry, not Sheikha, Rashid. It puts Rashid into name and Alain into location. But this time, if I switch the order around, it no longer matters. And when I hit run again, you can see it does exactly the same thing, because it knows uh, which argument is associated with which parameter. So this can make your code less error, but it does make each line of code longer. I recommended using your judgment to figure out when you want to use which type of argument, and depending on the need, you can pick between these two. So that's all about today's video. So consider subscribing and join our WhatsApp community and Instagram, which link is given in the description. So until the next video, take care and bye bye.